Hello students, on behalf of Patukala College of Commerce and Management, I welcome you all to this video lecture session on the subject of organizational behavior. This subject is a part of the semester 3 syllabus of the SYBBI course. In this session, we are going to study about the topic learning, the meaning of learning and its different types. In this session, we are going to touch upon these topics. We'll first learn what is learning, that is the meaning of learning, and then we'll see what are the different types and categories of learning, which includes the classical conditional theory, the operant conditional theory, and then the social behavior learning. Learning is an important psychological process that determines the growth in any individual behavior. So it is the process by which experience or practice results in a relatively permanent change in the behavior or the potential behavior of any individual. So learning can be defined as any relatively permanently change in the behavior and which is occurring as a result of any previous experience, right? So learning, number one, involves change. It has to be relatively permanent, and the individual changes the behavior when his or her beliefs or attitudes are changing because of either some kind of study or some kind of previous experience. Only then we can say that the individual has learned something, right? So learning can be categorized into three kinds. We have mentioned these three kinds in the slide. The first one is classical conditioning, wherein a response is now getting elicited by or as a result of some kind of stimuli, some kind of stimulus. Operant learning, again, which it is a type of learning in which the behaviors are being emitted to earn either any kind of reward or to avoid a negative experience, that is a punishment. The third kind is the social cognitive learning theory, which is again a kind of learning which is happening by observing a model or observing others, right? So all these three kinds of learnings we are going to study in detail. The first kind of learning is called the classical conditioning theory. Now, this was the first type of learning that was discovered, and since it was based on the behaviorist tradition, it was called classical. This came about in the 20th century by a Russian physiologist. He was a Russian scientist who was trained in biology and medicine, and he conducted the classical conditioning theory of learning, Ivan Pavlov, right? What he did was he performed experiments to teach dogs to salivate in response to the ringing of a bell. Now, if you remember the previous slide when we gave you a gist of what was classical conditioning, it was basically learning was happening through a response or a reaction to some kind of stimulus happening, right? So here what he used was he was ringing a bell and he was observing and he was trying to teach the dogs to salivate, or he was trying to create or elucidate a response to that ringing of the bell, and so that he could just observe and experiment how he could train them, give them some kind of learning uh, as per their requirements, right? That was classical conditioning theory came about. What he did thereafter was Pavlov proceeded to link meat with the ringing of the bell. So he presented meat with ringing of the bell, and the dog began to salivate, and he began to understand that whenever there is a bell ringing, there is food which is arriving. So this process was repeated several times, and the dog began to associate the ringing of the bell with the arrival of meat, his food. After a while, Pavlov rang the bell without presenting the meat. This time too the dog salivated. So we got the four elements in classical conditioning theory, which is the unconditioned stimulus, the unconditioned response, the conditioned stimulus and the conditioned response. Now here in this case the meat is the unconditioned stimulus, right? The unconditioned response is that it is the natural response, that is the salivation of the dog. Conditioned stimulus is basically when it is the reaction is getting associated with unconditioned stimulus. It is a conditioned response when it is triggered. So in this case merely the ringing of the bell is the neutral stimulus, and ringing the bell together with presenting the meat to the dog becomes conditioned stimulus. The fourth element is the conditioned response. It is the learned response to the previously neutral stimulus, right? In this experiment, in this Pavlov's experiment, the learned response is salivation because of the repeated association of the ringing of the bell and the presentation of the meat, right? That brings us to the principles of classical conditioning theory, or the phenomena which are then associated with this kind of learning. First is the acquisition, that response happens gradually. It takes time for this kind of learning. Generalization, that response is similar to a range of similar stimuli. So if we uh, swap meat with some other kind of reward or some other kind of favorable result, we are going to get the same kind of reaction to that kind of item or reward or food. Discrimination, that response is different to similar stimuli. This might also happen when the respondent is different. Extension, gradual disappearance of a conditioned response. This also might happen with time, with change in the nature of the person or the behavioral patterns of that personality of that respondent. And spontaneous recovery, that is reappearance of a conditioned response to conditioned stimulus. So this dog, even later on in his life, if he comes across a similar kind of a ringing of a bell, he might unconsciously in his mind associate that sound to meat or to some kind of food. So that is spontaneous recovery. So these are all the phenomena or the principles that are associated with classical conditioning theory, and they are still very much in use for training sessions. In the late 1930s, an American psychologist, B.F. Skinner, he worked upon similar experiments and coined the operant conditioning. This is the second type of learning we are going to study about. And operant conditioning is what? It is a type of conditioning again in which desired voluntary behavior leads either to a reward or it prevents a punishment. So as in the image we can see that one rat is basically telling another rat that once the light goes on and I pull the lever, the food comes in. So he is associating a particular action or a particular behavior with either a reward or a punishment. So this type of learning, therefore, it occurs through rewards or punishments for different types of behavior, and likewise the association is made between that kind of behavior and the specific consequences that this behavior entails. In this theory, basically operant, this term is defined as the behavior that produces effects. Operant conditioning, therefore, it suggests that people either emit responses that are rewarded, and they will not do something, that is, they will not emit responses that are either not rewarded or punished. So there has to be some consequence of each and every action, and thereupon, based on that consequence, they will be defining, they will be deciding upon the next type or the future behavior, right? So this is basically this behavioral modification. This identifies the types of consequences. It is also called the contingencies of reinforcement, right? This involves either this reinforcement is, we can say, it's a stimulus, It can be positive, it can be negative, and it generally follows a response, right? And following the response, it increases the likelihood of that response when it is repeated again and again. So positive reinforcement can be there, negative reinforcement can be there, extinction can be there, then punishment can be there. Positive reinforcement happens when it occurs when the introduction of a consequence increases or maintains the frequency of the future probability. Right? For instance, if the manager rewards the employee with a monetary appreciation for a job well done, then there is a probability of performing a good job. This probability increases in the future, right? When they are getting such kind of rewards. Negative reinforcements are also when the removal or the avoidance of a consequence increases or maintains the frequency. For example, again, if the manager ignores the employees reporting late to work, this bad quality or this bad habit might again either increase or it might continue. So that is negative reinforcement. Punishments are when the consequence is decreasing the future probability of the behavior. Punishment involves, it can be either positive punishments, it can be negative punishments. Positive punishments can be maybe a transfer which is effective to the sales employee if a critical client fails to place the targeted order. Negative punishment can be if the sales manager loses the perks and benefits if they do not meet the sales target, right? Now this brings us to the schedules of reinforcement. Behavior modification identifies the schedule that should be followed to maximize this kind of reinforcement effect. So it can either be continuous, that is the reinforcer is receiving each time a participation or a participant is showing the desired behavior each time this reinforcement is happening. It can be partial, that is rewards are given to some responses but to not to each and every response, right? Partial reinforcement can either be fixed ratio schedule, can follow a fixed number of times, that is the response is reinforced after a fixed number of responses maybe. It can be variable ratio schedule, that is in other words the response is reinforced after an unspecified or a random number of responses. It can be fixed interval, that is it occurs when the behavior is reinforced after a fixed or a known period of time. Or it can be variable interval schedule, that is the response is rewarded after an unpredictable unknown amount of time, right? So these are the four kinds or the four types of intermittent or partial reinforcement, and these are a part of the schedules of reinforcement. The third kind of learning which we are going to study today is social learning. This was developed by Albert Bandura, and he basically explained how an employee in a work setup, that employee learns when someone demonstrates how to do a particular job or by merely listening to a trainer. So this type of learning is also called learning by observations, and it occurs when an individual observes or he tries to imitate the behavior of others. So either when they are trying to observe, that is cognitive learning is happening. This can either be latent or learned helplessness or latent learning, or it can be through modeling, that is when that person is trying to copy what others are doing. So cognitive learning again, it focuses on how the information is obtained, what process is that information going through, how is it being processed, how is it being organized, and mainly mental process learning is the cognitive learning. It can either be latent learning, that is hidden learning, or it can also be learned helplessness, that is when you are trying to attempt what you have learned and you are failing at it. Belief can occur to you or can develop on you that the situation is uncontrollable, so that is learned helplessness, that is also happening inside your mind. So these two types of cognitive learning is associated with this kind of learning. The second type is modeling. Modeling is happening when you are trying to copy what others are doing, and what we see, and that is exactly what we are trying to do. We are trying to imitate after watching someone do something, and what you were not able to do it before this, right? So this might be actual, that is the individual actually demonstrates the desired behavior and sets an example. Social learning can be actual, it can be verbal, that is the individual provides directions or descriptions or explanations how the desired behavior is expected out of the followers or the students or the observers. Or it can be symbolic, like if a real or a fiction character is considered for modeling the desired behavior, and the character, you identify that with that character, and then you are trying to learn that in a similar kind of situation what you would be doing if you face a similar kind of situation. So social learning can be through either actual demonstrations or actual experiences. It can be verbal through instructions and descriptions, or it can be symbolic, that is through demonstrating the real life or fictional situations where you are trying to adapt, you are trying to know what is to be done. When we are trying to learn through this kind of modeling behavior, these are the steps that are involved in the process. First is attention. That is, in order to learn, the individual must pay attention to the behavior or the style of the model, right? So if you're wanting to imitate the behavior of your leader, you must be careful and attentive enough so that you understand how that behavior or how that kind of performance is coming across, right? So you need to be attentive. Next is retention, that is your ability as a learner to store information which is obtained while that attention, while that attentive observation rather, right? So learning can take place only if you can remember what is observed. That is what is retention all about. Reproduction. Learning happens, as we have seen in the very second slide, that learning is the permanent change in your behavior, right? So if you are just remembering what you have observed and you are not able to reproduce it in your setting or in your need of situation, we cannot say that you have learned your skills well, right? So reproduction is the next step, that is you have to, or the individual should be able to reproduce the same behavior as observed. Next comes motivation. Now for the whole learning process to be successful, a person or the learner must be motivated enough to imitate the model behavior, right? So when you are trying to learn by observation, first you need to have this kind of positive incentives that yes, I am going to learn from it, and you need to be self motivated to keep on doing it. So motivation is something which again brings us back to attention, and the whole loop continues. Many organizations emphasize on learning through experience, as it enables the employees to understand the knowledge, to acquire the skills, and they are also exposed to real life situations by observation. And this learning through experience can be best understood by David Kolb's experiential learning theory, or it is also called the ELT theory. This theory consists of the four-stage cyclical process. We'll see each stage. First is the concrete experience. Concrete experience is the first stage, which begins with the assumption that learner's own experience is insufficient, it is irrelevant for the learning to take place, and hence the learner can create experience only by adopting simulation or role plays or on the job trainings. Now these are the tools which it is going to help you to get a concrete experience of either doing or having that kind of experience. Simulations are artificial situations which give you a real life experience, kind of a real life experience. Role plays are also similar things, and on the job training is uh, the skills you are understanding, the skills you are acquiring while doing the real job. So concrete experience. It leads us to the second stage, that is reflective observation. Here, once you have started doing the job, or you have got a real life or a real time experience of doing similar kind of job, the learner must now reflect on their experience. It involves mainly listening, watching, recording maybe if necessary, or elaborating on your experiences. You need to review or reflect on your experiences which you got while the concrete experience was happening, and you need to ask the right questions to your own self, that what did I notice during this experience, why did it happen, does it happen in life, or how can these inputs be used in the real life, right? Next stage is the abstract conceptualization. That is, the concepts are now developed and integrated into the observations to form sound logical theories. For example, if the incident is related to motivation, you should now be able to develop concepts related to motivation. It can either be rewards, it can either be related to punishments or motivational factors. So basically, you are now trying to see what you know theoretically, and you are trying to associate that with a practical observation or practical experience what you have got, and you are trying to conceptualize those theoretical concepts into the logical thinking part of your brain, right? Next stage and the last stage is active experimentation. So here active learning takes place. It involves testing all the above stages in the new simulation, new situation, in a new context. So you're basically trying to see how viable or how reliable is the theory, or is what you know, or how reliable is the abstracts what you conceptualized in the third stage, right? So in this case, the learner must be involved in a real complex and stressful situation, so the effective learning takes place. So you are basically facing challenges, facing stressful environments, so you are trying to see whether you are able to uh, bring to play or utilize whatever knowledge you have gained in all the other previous stages. So these were the three kinds of learnings which is still very very prevalent, and it is also going to help you a lot as students when you go on studying new concepts in life. I hope this session was useful to you, and meet you in the next session. Thank you so much.